All right, so we are going to start off, creating a basic Node.js app. So to do this, we have to make sure that Node.js is installed on our system, and we also have to make sure that we have MongoDB installed on our system. So currently, I have, MongoDB, and I think we are already connected. So I'll try to reconnect to the database. So you say it's connected to localhost. Then we are also going to use Postman to test out our API endpoints. All right, so first thing first, we have to create a Node.js app. So to do that, I'm going to type npm init --y. So this is going to take a few seconds to create a Node.js app. So on the left hand side, as you can see, we have the package.json. So the package.json stores all of our dependencies. So we are going to go ahead and install some dependencies in our app. So but before doing that, we have to create an index.js file. Then we also have to install the dependencies. So npm install. So the first dependency I'm going to need for this is express and mongoose. So mongoose is actually what we are going to use for the mongodb connection and node.js. Then we are going to use cause. So let's wait a few minutes for these dependencies to install. All right, so after the installation of the packages, so the first thing you get to notice is that we have a node modules folder right here. So this is where the packages are stored, the packages that we installed and their dependencies. This is where Node.js stores them. Now inside the package.json file, we also have these packages, these dependencies right here. So you can see these are the packages we installed and these are the versions. Okay, so first thing that we need to do here is to start up a Node.js server. So to do that, I'm going to write some code. So I'll import express. So this 3001 is actually the port our server is going to be running on. So I can actually fetch maybe get this port from the .env file. So that means we have to create a .env file right here, and then we need to go back to our index.js file and use the port in the .env file. All right, so this means that we are using this port number in our index.js file. So what it does is that when our server starts up, it is going to check here for all the environmental variables and use it in our project. So let's go ahead and start up the server. So to do that, let me do node index.js. So we have an error message here. It says cannot use import statement outside the module. So we forgot to set the type of the project that we are working on. So this is supposed to be a type module. And let's go back and try to spin up our server again. Alright, so our server is currently running, and the first thing that we need to do to create a connection from our MongoDB, to Node.js is, to create a file for initialization. So let's go here and create a new file. call it db.js. So inside this db.js, we are going to create the function, to initialize database connection. So I'm going to import mongoose from mongoose. So this is actually the MongoDB connection string. So we are going to copy this and put it in our .env file. Another thing is the name of the database. I would like to call it Node CRUD. So this is going to be the name of our database, and let's go back to the db.js file and use the MongoDB URI here. Alright, so we have a function that is going to help us initialize our mongoose connection, and also if the connection is successful, we get a message. So I'm going to put this in a try block. Alright, so currently we have the file and it's ready. So the next step here is to create a mongoose model. So we are going to create an employee model. So first thing I will import here is the mongoose schema and also the mongoose model. So for the schema, what we'll need is the first name. It's going to be of type string, and it's going to be required. And lastly, we are going to require the email. So it's going to be unique. So the unique actually means that no two employees are going to share the same email. Alright, so now our schema is ready to go. So the next step actually is to create an API route. So this API routes, could really help us send requests to our server on the particular port 3001 and also receive responses from our server. So the first thing I would like to do is I'll go back to the index.js and I'll have to test if this server is actually working. So to do that, let's create an API route that is going to help us know if the server is actually working. So I'll do app.get. So the first thing I'll do here is, let's say server is up and running. So whenever we send a request to this particular route, we expect to get this message. So if we're unable to get this message, it means that our server is not running. So before doing that, I'll have to restart our server right here. So I will have to stop our server and run it again. So let's go to our Postman and try this endpoint. So the endpoint is actually HTTP localhost 3001. Let's try. So let me see if there's any error. Okay, so actually it is not able to reach our server. I'll try again, and we have to go back to our server and find out why. So let me try to log these ports on the console. So as you can see, it says that our console is not even able to fetch the port number. So that means the port is not being detected. So in the current in the latest version of Node.js, we can get the environmental variables without installing any packages. But before doing that, we have to specify which file we are using for our environmental variable. So in my case, we are using .env file. So to do that, before running our server, we have to specify the env file we are using. So this is the command right here. So let's run it again and see. So as you can see, it says server is running on port 3001. So we don't need to install any package to do this, because in the previous versions of Node.js, you needed to install the .env package to be able to get the environmental variable files. But now you can specify it in the flag and run your script without actually installing any package. So let's go back to our Postman and fetch our server again. As you can see, it says server is up and running. So this means that we can perform our CRUD operations. So the first step we are going to take to write out the API endpoints is to first of all create the file for interacting with the API endpoint. So let's go and create the file. So the name of the file is going to be route.js. So the first thing that we need to do here is to create the endpoints for creating an employee, deleting an employee, updating an employee, and also viewing an employee. So I have to go back to the model and check if we actually exported this model. So we did not export it, so we need to export it right here. So now this means that we can access it from other files. So let's go back to our route.js. All right, so the first thing that we want to do here is that we want to fetch all the employees, and also want to be able to post new employees. We also want to get the employees by their ID, and we want to delete employees and also update employees. So let me go ahead and complete the controllers. So the first step here is to complete all the controllers one by one. So we need to make this an asynchronous function. So for posting the employees, we want to be sure that they have these particular values. So we have to check for the first name, last name, and also email from the request body. So if any of these field is not available, we want to return an error message to the user telling them that they need to fill in all the required fields. Then if all the fields are complete, so we want to save it to the database. So I like to use the same thing I use here for my error message. Okay. So first we need to make this an asynchronous function. Alright, so lastly we have to work on the put and the get ID and delete. So basically what we're doing here is that when you want to fetch a particular employee, so you have to specify their ID. Then we have to check if the ID exists in the request parameters. So if the ID doesn't exist, we have to send an error message back to the user telling them to please provide an ID. Then if the ID is available, then we can run this code and fetch the ID. So when we are able to get the ID, then we can return it back to the user. So the second to the last endpoint is actually to delete, so I'm going to put it after the put endpoint. So it's almost the same thing here, we just have to change a few things. So right here, instead of finding by ID, we are going to find by ID and delete. So this is actually what we are going to be doing here. And the message is going to be employee deleted successfully. They would also put this in a try and catch block. Oh, I made a mistake. So this is actually supposed to be the delete endpoint, and I'm going to use this as the put endpoint. So I'm going to copy this file that we have here. And I'll paste it in here. So I'm going to make this an asynchronous function. So we are also going to be fetching the ID. So we want to fetch the ID. So first thing is we fetch the ID. Then using the ID, we can also check for these bodies. So if they exist, then what we need to do is that we have to use the first name, check if the first name, the last name, and the email exist. So if they exist, then the next thing that we want to do is that we want to update the database. So I'll have to go back here and do update database, updates employee. So I want to find by ID and updates. So another thing I want to point out is if the ID exists, then we also want to update that. But if maybe, let's say, we want to first of all specify the ID here and then use this object to update it. So I think we have to go and test out our API endpoints to see if it actually works. So let's go back to our server and restart it. So our server is running, and one more thing that we need to do is that we have to export these routes. So in our index.js file, I'll need to import the routes. And then we have to do app.use router. So now we need to impute the root, this is going to be called the root endpoint. So for this particular endpoint, we want to first of all specify that this endpoint is for employees. So right here, I'm going to do employees. And then let's rerun this server and try to interact with this API endpoint from Postman. So I think we have a problem. It says cannot find module imported from so we have to look for this particular router and find out what the problem could be. So going back to our rad.js, I think we actually exported here.